So now this is better, and now everything looks correct. But also it's possible to remove the double quotes altogether, and I'll do this in both places where we refer to the factory object. So again, I just copy and paste the changed version right here. And now in this case, the name of the class, right, the name of the class after the column, right, so this is the object name, this is the class name. So it gets moved in a diagram to the next line, to a separate line. So we have this box with 2 lines now, which is nice, but double quotes can be re-added around our object and the identifier of the class. So now we can actually re-add the quotes individually around both of these. The object name now sits in quotes, and now the class also is inside the quote. So I just remember to make this change everywhere in my diagram. So I copy and paste this like that, and again my change really does not affect the appearance of the diagram, okay, but at the same time, the double quotes are helpful if you want to use spaces in class names. So typically in programming language, of course, it's not possible, but in diagramming, it's a set of cosmetic adjustments that you can attempt, and now we can maybe add spaces to use spaces in the name of the class, right? So it may be good or not so good in terms of, like, you know, you probably need to be consistent then in everywhere where you're using identifiers with multiple words, like multiple combination of words. So we need to be consistent everywhere. But again, these are cosmetic changes, and recall that the first version of this diagram would probably the one that I would prefer in terms of the style. But all of these options are available right here in this tool. Many syntax examples are built directly into the sequence tool. You can go to examples and try to view what they display. So right here, of course, I think we already covered all of this. This is just the default format for the sequence. There's also second example that we talked about the return values, and I'm using now double quotes sometimes in my notation. The next example is method arguments. We talked the possibility to use parentheses next to the method and specify multiple parameters passed to the method. So we already covered this as well in our talk. And the next thing is that, once again, the class names can be used together with object names in the sequence diagram in terms of the showing the participants with the class name and the object name. Also, in part of this example is object stereotypes. So let me just talk about this a little bit. I think the syntax here, I'll just show you perhaps a practical example of this syntax. So the stereotype is simply just like an addition to the class name using this type of notation. So basically something surrounded by like a special type of quotation with the double opening and double closing angle brackets. So this can be useful if, for instance, we wanted to display an object like an array list, or just simply list in Java. So for instance, we have a list right here, and we want to specify that this is a list of visitors, okay, and we want to add our visitor right here, visitor, to this list. Okay, so something like this with, again, I mechanically add return types that look like this, and maybe I can do it like this. As part of our new, and this visitor may be returned from the constructor. And so let's take a look at this example. I hope my syntax is correct, and we just copy and paste it right here. Okay, so so this is just just a series of experiments. So here you see that part of the simulation scenario, create visitors, right? So this operation of simulation scenario wants to go to the factory and say create visitor. So this creates a visitor which calls new constructor for visitor shopper, because this was the factory specific to the shopper. And so the visitor is now returned from here, right? So we call the constructor and we say that the object, the name object now is the visitor. And so we call this add visitor and we call into list of visitors. And this is the type of the stereotype that this tool is trying to allow us to use. Is basically the list is parameterized by some other type. And so here we just say that we want this list to remember this visitor that we just created. Okay, so this is an example of using a stereotype. So collections of objects typically are parameterized. So that's the notation or terminology used by the sequence tool. Other examples here. Iteration is actually pretty simple idea. So we can use an idea of iteration is just simply that, for instance, create visitors, right? So we say create visitors, and we can specify here count, right? So we can specify some sort of count to create visitors. So maybe we want to use a counter to specify how many visitors we want to create. So I'll just add it directly here in my script. I'll add some count, which indicates that I want to create multiple visitors. And here, because we need to call create visitor every time we want to create a visitor, we can use this asterisk in front of the name, directly in front of the name of the method, like this. You see that it just instantly appears as an asterisk. I apologize, this is a small format of this diagramming tool for my screen resolution, but there is an asterisk right here in front of the method. So it's just very simple idea is that syntax of this sequence diagramming tool permits using iteration notation. So this is an iteration notation for sequence diagrams. I am not in big favor of actually doing this. I think it'd be possible to perhaps add documentation that accompanies this sequence diagram and explains in detail that when we create visitors, we just like call this method create visitor inside our factory X number of times, or the number of times specified by the count, because those little things are hard to spot. If this diagram grows in size and complexity, some of these things are not so easy to spot, so their benefit may be questionable. Again, it depends who is the audience of your diagram. Who is this designed for? If this is for an expert user that wants to get a grasp of what you're trying to do, all of these little tiny details could be a bit of an excess in your diagram. So, but if you'd like to use it for some detailed analysis of a use case, because you want to just provide as many details as possible in your analysis, trying to validate things, then of course it's okay. But I think that using a normal plain language description of your design is also a primary consideration when you're designing your diagrams. So there are example of conditions that could be used in sequence diagrams. I'm pretty much against these type of things because they just complicate things enormously. So there could be method stereotypes as well. There could be callbacks. So the callbacks are a pretty simple idea. So in a callback situation, what you have is just showing that, for instance, here we have some kind of object that basically gets method 1 of this object gets invoked. So this is an activation method for this method 1 inside object 1. So the next thing that's happening is that we call method 2, which of course belongs to this class, right? So right here we call method 2 and it begins to execute. Then from here we call method 3 that belongs to another object. And this method 3 calls another method within itself, right? So this shows actually here that this object invokes a method that also belongs to this class. And so we then return and return and return. So we're now back to method 2 execution, which continues, and then it calls another method inside another object like this. And from here you can see that we kind of call back into this object and executing another method, a part of the sequence of calls. Then of course we return back, and then we return back, and then we return back, and finally we exit out of this sequence. But these types of situations are kind of like callback thing. It's just another method call. There's nothing really specific to it. It's just something that is placed here under examples under the name callbacks. We already talked about all the names, and you can see this example in terms of using the syntax, what you can and cannot use inside these double quotes. And there's also syntax for single quotes that is also available here. So you can experiment with naming your classes and using all sorts of possibilities with that as well. And finally, there's an example that kind of like shows all parts of syntax in one concise demonstration right here.